Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. One of the thinkers that had a very profound influence on my worldview was a French politician and journalist named Frederic Bastiat. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. I always butcher the French names, but nevertheless, he really impacted me. He was a great simplifier of complex economic ideas, and he really put moral concepts into simple terms that everybody can understand. And his writings, although he wrote in the mid 1800s, are still applicable to what we're dealing with today. And I recently read an article about how he applies in to what's known as modern monetary theory. And I asked the author of that article on. He is a fellow at the Mises Institute, and his research focuses on Austrian economics, inflation in the business cycle, and economic history of economic thought. Dr. Jonathan Newman, welcome to the show. Back to the show. You've been here before, so it's a
Yeah,
welcome
yeah. Thanks
back.
for having me back on. It's good to be here.
Okay, so what are some of the insights that Bastiat brought into the economic realm? Were his economic teachings?
Sure. I could talk about two just to give people a preview. One of his most famous works is called The Law. And in The Law, he makes a distinction between two different ways that people can earn income or acquire wealth. And so he talks about how people can go through like the political means, so they can use the government to acquire wealth from other people. And Bastiat points out how that's sort of like an illegitimate, or most people would consider that an immoral way of acquiring resources if you're just sort of taking it from other people. But then he also talked about the workings of the market economy and the way that we exchange with each other, and there's mutual benefit. So involuntary exchange, when I get something from you, it's because I prefer what I'm giving up in exchange. And you could say the same thing about the other person from their perspective. So there's this reciprocity, there's this agreement between trading partners in the market economy. And so that's sort of his focus in the laws. He's talking about how the law is perverted, how the government is perverted in such a way as that it turns into everybody is trying to live at the expense of somebody else or everybody else. I think that's actually an exact quote from his work. I think he says politics is the art of everybody trying to live at the expense of everybody else. And so it's in government and in politics, it's like a dog eat dog, zero sum type situation. But in the market, it's positive sum, it's mutual benefit, and people getting along and cooperating, and entrepreneurs producing things that consumers desire. So that's his main point in the law.
The
But
law,
another thing,
hold on one second. I want to ask you. So the law basically is the focus is on morality, on the morality of politics, not on the morals of how each individual acts, but that in essence, he argues that human beings have the right to life, liberty, and property. Basically, he's a more modern version of Locke in essence. Very, very similar. The two quotes, I love these quotes. He says, the law perverted and the police powers of the state perverted along with it. And then he says, the state is the great fictitious entity whereby everybody tries to live
that's
at
it.
the expense of everybody else. And I found it very convincing because he says, look, he says each individual has the right to his life, his liberty, and his property, to act to maintain himself. And if somebody were to encroach on a person's life or property, that person has the right of defense. And then by logic, he says, so if that guy wants to get together with another guy and they want to have a mutual defense pact, that would be fine. And you could multiply that, into millions if necessary, where if people want to get together to defend their lives, liberty, and property, that's fine. And that is the proper role of government, he says. But no matter how many people you get together, they will never have the right to infringe on the rights of others. So just as it's unright, I have no right to rob Jonathan Newman. If I get another guy with me, we don't have the right, and it doesn't matter how many we get together. And the clarity of that argument, I just it penetrated the depths of who I am to such a degree. I mean, Walter Williams, the great economist, said something to the effect of the law brought clarity to his thinking in relation to politics. Okay, I just wanted to be a fanboy for Bastiat for a minute, but go ahead,
Yeah,
continue.
he has that effect on a lot of people. Since his writing is so clear and his thinking is it's so well expressed, he has that effect on people. For a lot of people, it's really their doormat into the liberty sphere, into thinking about the government is not here to help us. The government is not this it's not this entity that has everybody's best interests in mind, but it's actually it's something more sinister than that, and it's got all these unintended consequences, and the moral foundations of the state itself are suspect. Bastiat was really great at sort of like giving people an introduction into that sort of view. The other work that he's most well known for is it's an essay called "That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen." Some people will like shorten it; they'll talk about the seen and the unseen, and that's where Bastiat goes through his famous broken window parable, where he talks about how there's this hoodlum, this boy that breaks a shopkeeper's window, and a crowd gathers to think about the economic consequences of this event, and they come to the conclusion that it's good for the economy, for their little community, because now the shopkeeper is going to have to spend money to get the window replaced, and now the person who repairs the window, the glazier, they have money that they can now spend on other items, and so this broken window has stimulated spending and employment in their community. That's the conclusion that the crowd draws. But then Bastiat corrects that view. So he says that view is a fallacy. There's an error there. And the error comes from ignoring what the shopkeeper would have done with the money if he didn't have to replace his window. And so once you consider that, once you consider the unseen, so that's why it's called that which is seen and that which is unseen, once you consider that counterfactual course of events, then you see that the real effect of the broken window is it's just a broken window. It's real resources are destroyed. The economy is worse off. There's no new spending and there's no new employment that's added to this economy. It's just a redirection. So instead of the spending and employment going first towards the glass repair business, if the window is unbroken, the spending and employment would have gone in another direction. And I think in the example from Bastiat is the I think it was a new suit. Yeah, the shopkeeper was going to buy a new suit. The reason I'm questioning is because Henry Hazlitt came behind Bastiat,
and economics in one
retold the
lesson.
story, and he sort of changed up the example. It was like a baker instead of a shopkeeper, and it was shoes instead of a suit. But the idea is the same. The broken window did not stimulate. It didn't create new economic activity. It just redirected it. It just changed the way resources were used in the economy, and you have a broken window, and you have a loss of real resources. So involuntary destruction is always bad for an economy. It always reduces our total wealth. And there's been a lot of commentary on this, many ways to apply this. In fact, Henry Hazlitt, he uses that as the first application in Economics in One Lesson, as you mentioned. And he just goes on and he shows how that sort of thinking, when you consider the counterfactual, when you consider the long-term consequences, when you consider the influence or the consequences of some event or policy on all groups as opposed to one group, it brings greater clarity to whatever you're trying to analyze. And so he takes that and he applies it to tariffs. He applies it to the minimum wage. He applies it to government subsidized credit, and so on and so forth, all down the line, and shows how there's really nothing that the government can do to improve our lot. So whenever the government is spending, whenever the government is implementing some sort of regulation, it comes at a cost. It's like the broken window. It doesn't stimulate new employment. Government spending doesn't create more jobs or create more economic activity. All it does is it redirects the way resources would have been used if they were still left in private hands.
So Bastiat basically in the 1840s destroys the idea by implication that war is good for the economy.
Yeah, you could apply it to war, you could apply it to natural disasters. And you see these arguments, they're still being made today. And it's quite unfortunate that Bastiat's ideas haven't caught on or people haven't realized this. But like after every single hurricane, so I live in Alabama, every time there's a hurricane that comes through, there's always at least one article that pops up, usually from like a local news outlet, saying, you know, it's not all bad news, because while this hurricane has caused a lot of damage, it's stimulating a bunch of spending on home improvement and repairs, and so like the argument is still made, and like you said with war as well, people still today are making the argument that war spending is good for the economy. Like if we just dump more money at these defense contractors, then we can boost GDP and we'll all be better off as a result. But if you remember Bastiat, if you read Hazlitt, then you'll know that no, this is not new wealth. This is a diversion of wealth, and it's pulled away from the private productive part of the economy and into government hands. So where the best we can say is, who knows how worthwhile it is, but I think we can all agree that there's a ton of waste in government, and they don't have the sort of profit and loss feedback mechanism that exists in the private market economy to know that what they're doing is actually beneficial for everybody.
Are you familiar with Bastiat's satirical essay about the Candlemaker's petition?
Yes, I love that. So it's such a I mean, everything Bastiat did was great. So in that it is satire. It's Bastiat writes it as like the candle makers industry that is arguing against this new competitor that's come on the scene, and they're arguing that this industry needs to be protected to save the jobs that are in the candle making business. We need to enact these sorts of regulations to prevent that competitor from and it's an external competitor, so it's like outside the country, prevent that competitor from putting all these people out of work. And of course, later on, I can't remember exactly when, but he sort of leads the reader on, and he reveals that the external competitor is the sun itself. So it's the fact that sunlight exists. And so the regulations that he proposes in this petition is people need to be forced to keep their windows closed. They all these sorts of things, basically to prevent people from being able to make use of sunlight, so that we can prop up the candle making industry. It's just beautiful. It's just another way that the things that Bastiat wrote about back then they're always relevant, because people are always coming up with protectionist ideas. With Keynesianism, there's all sorts of commissions of the broken window fallacy. It's just across the board in journalism and in economics. So that's why Bastiat, we need to keep reading Bastiat today. So the fact that he was writing in the early 1800s, I think he died in 1848. The fact that it's old doesn't make it less readable and less relevant. In fact, like I still laugh when I'm reading the Candlemaker's petition, just because it's so well written. And I don't know, it's been translated into English from French, but still, like, the ideas are clear and it makes so much sense.
So I thought that John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics were bad right up through, his most famous disciple today living, Paul Krugman. But this modern monetary theory is like something out of a fantasy book. It's so absurd. But nonetheless, it's out there and it has its adherents and its advocates. So it needs to be refuted, unfortunately. So what's the basics of MMT, modern monetary theory?
Yeah, MMT stands for modern monetary theory, which is sort of funny that they have acquired. I don't know if they named themselves or if other people named them, but the fact that modern is in it is sort of funny, because really the ideas are old. The ideas, it's just old-fashioned inflationism. It's give the government the ability to print as much money as it wants to finance its own spending. But what's modern about it is they're enabling that idea and backing up that idea with accounting tricks, accounting tautologies, and new, like, terminological sort of tricks, like public deficits is a net financial surplus for the private economy, stuff like that. So like that sort of terminology is modern, but really the idea is old. You're right that it's sort of like Keynesianism on steroids, because the idea is that just give the government as much leeway, or the government in effect has as much leeway as it needs to spend as much as it wants. And really the only constraint that they talk about is, well, we don't want to cause too much price inflation. So if the government is financing deficit spending with debt monetization, so we're printing new money so the government can spend more, we don't want to cause too much inflation. And too much for them would probably be like, I don't know, like 5% price inflation from one year to the next, as opposed to of course, the moderate stable price, 2% inflation that's targeted by the Federal Reserve today. So like they say that we don't want to bump up against that sort of constraint, but if we're staying in a normal rate of inflation, then what's the big deal? The government will always be able to pay its debts because it has a money printer. They're a sovereign currency issuer, and so they'll always there will never be a decline in trust for government debt because it's always repayable. And so that, I mean, that's it in a nutshell. It's another thing that they do, and I talk about this in the article, is they sort of reverse the order of spending and taxation. So we just intuitively, we had this idea that the government needs to spend money that it already has, and it collects that money either through selling debt or through raising taxes. So like they collect some taxes, they sell some bonds, and that's what gives them the funds that they can then use to spend on various projects and programs and redistribution, so on. But what they reverse it, and so they actually start with government spending, and this spending injects new money into the economy, and then there's a separate question of how much do we want to buy back in the form of debt, so replace some currency with some government bonds, and how much do we want to collect in taxes. And really their thinking is that, well, let's use taxes as a way to put a tamper on inflation. So if inflation is getting out of hand, it means people have too much money that they're spending. So why don't we just suck some money out of the system by raising taxes? Which, so you can see that that's like a totally different way of thinking about the motivation for taxes. We're used to thinking about taxes as this is what the government pulls out of the economy so that they can then fund their projects. But what they're arguing is that no, the proper way to think about optimal taxes is what can we do to achieve the right level of inflation.
So at least with Keynes thought there were limits to inflation. He wasn't an out and out inflationist, although that may have been the implication. But I believe that Keynes actually was willing to work with Friedrich Hayek post World War II to try to combat the inflationary policies that were taking place. But it seems with these people, there's no breaks at all. They just feel that you can just pump as much money into the economy as you want, and there will be no harm. And you mentioned that they think the only real risk is price inflation. Now, I remember reading an article by Hazlitt, and I think I've read it in Mises as well, that price inflation isn't actually inflation. It's a side effect of the increase in the money supply. And it's not even the worst consequence. Now, in your bio, I read that you're a student or a teacher of business cycle theory, business cycles. So what would be the really bad consequences of these massive injections into the economy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a great point. So they view like too much government spending, too much government injection of money in the economy would be measured by excessive price inflation, however, whatever threshold they want to apply there. But you're absolutely right that there are many other consequences, both economic and cultural, social, financial, to in monetary inflation, and just one of those effects is price inflation. But you're right, if the inflation, if the new money is coming into the market through loan markets, so through credit markets, then that means it's going to distort the interest rate. It'll push the interest rate below what the unhampered market economy would have, and this has all sorts of effects. So it can encourages overconsumption. So if interest rates are down and also incomes are up, it'll encourage people to go out and spend more on consumption goods, and they'll decrease their savings. But probably more pernicious and more dangerous is what happens to the structure of production. So if interest rates are pushed below the natural rate, we'll say, then that's going to encourage businesses and entrepreneurs to start these longer term projects that is going to require a bunch of capital. It's going to require a bunch of capital goods in order for these projects to be completed. But if this process was started by just an injection of new green pieces of paper, or in our modern world, it's just, ones and zeros in cyberspace, then what it means is these entrepreneurs have started projects that can't be completed. So like, we actually haven't set aside resources for longer, more capital intensive production. In fact, we've actually eaten into our capital stock because we've been increasing our real consumption. So all these new projects are started, they can't be completed, and that's why it's called Austrian business cycle theory. It's like, it looks like there's this boom because consumption's up, businesses are being started, businesses are expanding, stock prices go up, capital goods prices go up, land values go up, real estate goes up, your house value goes up. So it looks like everything's great. Also, employment itself goes up. So the number of jobs in the economy increases because all these new projects are started. So it's this big boom period. And it's like a party. All of the numbers are great. It looks like the economy is just doing great. But like, if you just look under the hood, you'll see some signs where it looks like these businesses aren't going to be able to finish these projects. Like, they're having trouble acquiring capital and acquiring labor at prices that they thought they were going to be able to, and so they have to liquidate their projects. And it's a sort of thing that happens all of the sudden. It's like all of a sudden we sort of realize, hey, these stock prices are overinflated, real estate values are overinflated. We started building these massive neighborhoods with McMansions, but we don't have enough people to buy the houses that we're building, and so like you have abandoned neighborhood projects. So that's Austrian business cycle theory in a nutshell. It's the theory of an unsustainable boom. So it's what does the government do, or the Federal Reserve? This can also happen through fractional reserve banking. What happens when there's artificial credit that expands in this system, that pushes the interest rate down and affects the structure of production and affects overall consumption? So that's just one example. It's not just price inflation. So to the extent that MMT is only looking at price inflation as a constraint, it means that they're ignoring all of the other bad things that can happen. Other effects of inflation is people have less incentive to save over time, which means that we have fewer resources going towards productive employment. It means that people aren't as resilient for crises when they come. So like, when the actual economic crisis comes, they don't have savings that they can use. They're going to be looking for the government to bail them out. There's all sorts of literature about the psychological effects of inflation, the cultural consequences of inflation. You should, if you're interested in that, then I can send you or your listeners papers by George Guido Holzman or Joseph Salerno on that. But the idea that price inflation is the only thing that we should look at is totally wrong.
And there's also the problem, right, where Milton Friedman taught about the helicopter effect, where basically he thought that if there's an injection of money into the economy, it's as if a helicopter just, dumped it everywhere and it lands equally in everybody. But Friedrich Hayek talked about how that's not the case. The money goes into some hands first. So if I get the first batch of money at the old prices, now I've got all this extra cash and the prices are cheap, I can now go to Jonathan's store and buy stuff, but then prices start to rise. So you end up taking a loss, whereas I take a gain. So it's not just a matter of the prices rise for everybody and everybody is equally affected. Some people are benefiting and some people are harmed. And that's even aside from the business cycle effects that you talked about, right?
Well, actually, they're more connected than you might think. So I think it's appropriate to consider Austrian business cycle theory as just an application of the Cantillon effect. So that process you're describing is called the Cantillon effect. It refers to the non-neutrality of money, that money comes into the economy through a particular point, which means that the first spender, like you said, is able to acquire all these benefits. They're able to acquire resources from the market before prices rise. And then the people that they buy from now have higher incomes, so they can expand their demands for other goods. So prices come up in this like sort of sequence. It's like the money is rippling out and the increased demand for goods is rippling out from the center. And then here on the outskirts of this whole process, it's people whose incomes haven't risen, or maybe they're on a fixed income and so their income never rises at all. They have to pay those higher prices without their incomes having come up. And so you can sort of picture like resources are being shuffled towards the center. They're being shuffled towards where the money is coming into the economy. And of course, if you just think about our current monetary system, who are the great beneficiaries of that? And it's the government, it's the big financial institutions, it's the Federal Reserve, it's defense contractors, anybody who sells goods and services to the government. They're at the center. They're right under the money faucet. And then it's the middle class and the poor who are on fixed incomes and don't have assets to sell, that are expropriated from. So like their resources are actually moved towards the government in that case. And that's not even controversial, because if you think about it, like why would a counterfeiter do counterfeit? Like what's the purpose of counterfeiting? And the purpose is to acquire resources from the market. So it's obvious that that's the government's goal. Like the reason why we inflate is because we need to acquire resources from the market. If we think about this fantasy world where as soon as new money is printed, all prices rise proportionally, and incomes rise proportionally, then there would be no benefit to printing new money. So the fact that Cantillon effects exist is not, it's not controversial in my mind. It's like plain as day. It seems like that's obviously the motivation for the government and for their cronies, the big financial institutions.
Okay, you mentioned the Cantillon effect, and I'm guessing I've got a lot of listeners wondering what's Cantillon. So quickly, who was Richard Cantillon?
Yeah, so he's he is who Murray Rothbard considered the founder of modern economics. So he was writing in the mid 1700s before Adam Smith, and it was his idea. He had you guys should read Mark Thornton, who's written about Richard Cantillon a bunch. He had a sort of like a very adventurous life. Like you could write a movie about this guy. He profited a bunch off of the Mississippi land bubble. And there's like speculation about the circumstances surrounding his death. Like maybe he didn't actually die because he had a bunch of people who were mad at him because he saw that it was a bubble. And so he profited off a lot of other people's bad debts. And so people were mad at him. And so people speculate that he faked his death. Anyway, I'm not really talking about his economics, but Rothbard saw that there was a lot of good economic truth in Cantillon, even stuff about like subjective value, which didn't come until much later in the history of economic thought, stuff about the division of labor, market prices, and of course the Cantillon effect, which we've been
And he was
Irish,
right? He's from Ireland.
Yeah, I think you're right. He was maybe born in Ireland, but then lived in France.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay, so now that we've got the modern monetary nonsense, and we've got the great Bastiat, how does Bastiat's teaching, the seen and the unseen, apply to these modern monetary folks?
Yeah, so that's what I did in the article. I just took, so Stephanie Kelton is one of the most famous proponents of modern monetary theory. And she had this tweet thread where she was talking about what she considers the effects of government spending. And so she said, in her example, the government spends $100, the non-government sector now has $100, then the government taxes $90, and so the government's deficit is $10. So that deficit has added $10 to the non-government side, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so she had this sort of like step-by-step process where she was following what happens after the government spends $100. And then she talked about the difference between the government deciding to tax it, or the government deciding to sell bonds, or the government deciding to just leave the $10 in the economy, and like what are the effects of that. And so what I did is I just took those steps, the main ones, and just looked at Bastiat and asked, what would Bastiat say about this? So like, what are the effects of government spending? What are the effects of taxation? What are the effects of government backed or government subsidized credit? Because that's what government bonds are in effect. And so, you can imagine what is the conclusion? Well, Bastiat is considered, he emphasized the real resource costs. Like everything has a trade-off. There's an opportunity cost with everything. So when the government decides to spend, what happens? Well, that means that there's going to be a diversion of resources away from the private economy and towards government waste, towards whatever the government decides they want to spend money on. And in the case of taxes, it means that that's pulling money away from some industry or some business that they would be able to use productively. When the government decides to sell a bond, what does that do? Well, that crowds out private credit. So like if somebody decides to put their savings into a government bond, it means that now they can't put their savings in some other productive employment. So each step I just went through and showed how just like it, I mean, it's not even a difficult mental exercise. Just what are the true consequences of this act? And there's just no recognition of that in MMT. For MMT, it's all about the accounting tautologies. It's all about if the government increases its spending and has a deficit, that means that there's a net financial surplus on the private sector side. And so why are you guys whining? You guys shouldn't be complaining about this because now everybody's richer because the government has added this wealth to the private economy. And I mean, it just takes like a few seconds of reading Bastiat to see all of the errors in that line of thinking.
There sure are some errors. Oh, okay. Is there anything you think that we didn't cover that we should have covered in relation to this conversation?
So one thing that I did in the article, and I got a little bit of feedback about this, is I took their order for granted. So they start with government spending, and then there's the subsequent decision by the government to either tax or sell a bond. I just sort of took that for granted. I don't think that that's actually true. Like I think the correct way to think about it is that the government has to acquire funds in some way before they can spend it. And in fact, like right now, if you look at what the Treasury has been doing in the past couple of years, they've had to drain their accounts at the Fed for a variety of reasons. One reason is that they noticed at the end of 2023 that there was some declining demand for their debt, and like just that fact alone calls into question all of MMT. The fact that people can not trust the government to pay down their debts or to inflate away the value of the future payment for those bonds, future repayment of those bonds, means that like everything in MMT is now suspect. Like that very fact that people can question the value of government debt shows that at its core, MMT is at least has some flaws.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very, very much. So where can people find you?
So the article is posted at Mises.org, and they can find my other commentary there. So I post on the Mises Wire and also at the Power and Market blog, which is at Mises.org. And I'm on Twitter as well. My username is at Newman J_R. I hardly ever refer to that, so sometimes it's hard to remember.
All right. Well, thank you for a great discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. And remember to leave your comments, whether you liked it, you didn't like it, whatever. Let me know. It helps. Thank you. Till next time.